Good morning, everyone. I am Vanessa Acarantoro, Director of the Planning and Engineering Office of the Energy Bureau of the Puerto Rico Public Service Regulatory Board. It is 10:05 in the morning of Thursday, April 15, 2021, and we are commencing this technical conference in case number NEPR-AP-2018-0004, the unbundling of the assets of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. We are holding this technical conference remotely as a precaution to avoid the spreading of COVID-19. This morning, we are joined by Associate Commissioner Silvia Ugarte Araujo.
Good morning.
We would like to excuse the chairman who may be joining later and Associate Commissioners Ángel Rivera de la Cruz, Lilian Mateo Santos, and Ferdinand Ramos Segard. Also, we are joined by the Energy Bureau's technical consultants, Paul Chernick, Mark Level, Jeff Ackerman, and Miguel Tula. On February 5, 2021, the Energy Bureau issued a resolution order through which it established the procedural calendar for the instant case. Said procedural calendar monitors closely the work being performed by PREPA and its consultant in order to file its proposal for an unbundled rate for wheeling. As required in the April 9 resolution and order in the instant case, during today's technical conference, PREPA must present its preliminary findings on rate design and testing, discuss whether it has completed the necessary analysis for the default unbundling tariff and structure described in the December 23rd resolution and order, and discuss whether it is preparing an alternative unbundling proposal to be filed before the Energy Bureau. Further, PREPA must present its preliminary findings on the work performed in the Uniform Wheeling Agreement. The Energy Bureau may ask questions to PREPA regarding the information presented. Interveners may also ask clarifying questions to PREPA regarding the information presented during today's technical conference. Since the purpose of the technical conference is for PREPA to present its preliminary findings and to clarify questions regarding such information, discovery-type questions will not be allowed. This technical conference will be conducted in English and will be recorded in audio and video. It is being streamed live both in English and Spanish via the Energy Bureau's YouTube channel, and a copy of the recording will be made part of the administrative file for this case. We will now establish the instructions to be followed during the technical conference. Before addressing the Energy Bureau, please unmute your microphone. Before answering any question or addressing the Energy Bureau, all participants must identify themselves for the record by stating their full name and the entity they represent. Please keep your microphone on mute while not answering questions or addressing the Energy Bureau in order to avoid disturbances due to background noise. We will begin with PREPA's presentation, and then the Energy Bureau will ask questions to PREPA. Afterwards, the Energy Bureau will provide the opportunity for interveners to ask clarifying questions to PREPA on the information presented. Before proceeding with the agenda today, I'm going to ask PREPA's counsel for its attendance for today's technical conference.
Good morning to the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau. And all present or live streaming, my name is Attorney Janely Marrero on behalf of PREPA. Joining us today for the PREPA officials is Engineer Alfonso Baretti, Engineer Sujel Acevedo, and Ms. Josely Estrada. And from Guidehouse, our consultant is Mr. Ricardo Vega, Ms. Margot Everett, Laura Vogel, and Christina Stratford.
Thank you, Attorney Marrero. Likewise, I will go through the list of interveners as part of this case to ask if anybody is present during today's technical conference. For the Independent Consumer Protection Office, Ecoeléctrica,
Good morning, Vanessa. I was mute. I'm present here, Gerardo Cosme, consultant. ITC.
All right, thank you. From Ecoeléctrica? From the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association? And from Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica de la Montaña? Okay, thank you, everyone. Ms. Marrero, I'm gonna pass it over to PREPA to start its presentation.
Good morning, all. Mr. Ricardo Vega Montenegro from Guidehouse is going to be the introductory speaker for the Guidehouse presentation.
Thank you, Genevieve, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ricardo Vega from Guidehouse. I'm the director in charge of this project with PREPA, and I will introduce the technical conference today, going over the schedule that we presented in the first workshop. So as you recall, we started the project back in February 10th, where we requested a series of data collection efforts to PREPA, which they kindly and timely have delivered to us for review, and we have made progress and completed all data collection and data reviews. We have also completed the marginal cost of service study and conducted an internal workshop with the client. We are having the technical conference today, where we will see the results of our studies and some challenges that we have encountered. We've also initiated implementation assessment and have other workshops that are being scheduled and pending completion. We have started rate testing of the structure, and we've also started working on the uniform wheeling agreement draft and its structure. And we feel that much of the work that has been done to date has allowed us to prepare for the filing. So that is a work in progress, but we feel confident that we are going to be presenting the filing and doing a review and a quality control of the filing prior to May 10th. And afterwards, we will be preparing for the initial technical hearing. Does anyone have any questions with the schedule recap?
No, not me, please go ahead.
Okay, so with that, I will hand it over to Margot Everett, who is our subject matter expert and the director who has been leading the process of unbundling for wheeling rates. Margot, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We have a lot of material that we've included in our presentation. Throughout the presentation, you'll be hearing a couple of key themes. The first is that we, as Ricardo has already mentioned, we are on track to make a filing by the May 10th requirement. There are, however, a couple of things that need to be highlighted, and we will be doing this throughout the presentation. The first is that there's still a fair amount of sector structure uncertainty. And what we mean by that is that it's not clear what the future structure of the electricity sector will be within Puerto Rico. There are a lot of changing aspects of the marketplace, operations changes, roles and responsibility changes, and all of that uncertainty then leads to a second theme, which is data uncertainty. And so, and what we mean by data uncertainty and data volatility is that because there's so much change going on structurally, it's difficult for us to understand exactly what the future will look like and how costs will be structured and who is responsible for performing what activities and therefore what payments happen between and how money flows across the sector, which plays a major role in how you structure rates. The reason I'm highlighting this at the get-go is because this creates regulatory risk in two ways. The first is that if we are not measured and careful in how we structure this tariff, we can end up with cost shifting, and the cost shifting is most likely to be harmful to those individuals within Puerto Rico who do not have the flexibility or the wherewithal to leave the utility, the PREPA services for supply, and those tend to be customers who are low moderate income individuals. So we need to be particularly cautious and careful about how we allocate costs to make sure that we don't end up with that cost shifting, leaving those customers with a bulk of the responsibility to pay for infrastructure that's already in place. The second is that it can also create improper signals to the marketplace, motivating individuals outside of the utility right now to make investments in supply options, for example, making those decisions, and then as the sector structure solidifies, those decisions may be unwarranted because of some potential changes that may have to result. So again, one of the things you'll be hearing us talk about is we have developed a framework that we believe will be resilient throughout the sector restructuring, and it will be and we can apply it, but we have to also be very careful about any finite definition of an actual rate or rates to be implemented, because I fear that with these uncertainties, we could end up in a place that we don't want to be. Any questions on my opening comments? Great. So I'm going to push through as I said, there's a lot of material here. We're going to start with the rate design framework, so we can go ahead and go to the next step or the next slide. One more, please. So as we went through this process, we really identified 10 steps that we will follow. Interestingly enough, we also have 10 steps on the Uniform Services Agreement. So, but there were 10 distinct steps that we walked through and executed. And it was through these 10 steps, very deliberate process, that we identified some key findings and some key challenges, which we'll recap at the end. So starting off, the first question, which is the next slide, is the question of determining bundled sales. And let me just pause real quickly. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, there's a green dot with an explanation point. That is because these are the slides we intend to cover. We recognized ahead of time there's a lot of material, and some of it we had covered at the previous conference or is more in-depth information than you probably need for the conference. So we will emphasize the slides with the green dots. But if you have a question on any of the other slides, please stop me and we can address those. So as I said, the first step of unbundling services is you need to determine what the bundles are. And this is a typical framework that you see. A lot of times you'll hear the terms GenCo, Transco, and a DISCO. So the framework follows that format in that you have a GenCo or a supply function that provides the actual electricity. And then you have a wheeling function, that's the transmission function that brings power from your generators to your load centers. And then you have a delivery function, which delivers the electricity from the transmission system to your individual customers at the meter. Lastly, the last piece is billing. This is what we often call meter to cash, which is the idea that you put in a meter, you monitor the meter, you bill your customers, you collect from your customers, and also included in meter to cash are things like call center support and other types of customer support activities that you may do. Within each of these sections, there are sub activities. So within supply, you have three major activities going on. The first is the building of generation and creating the capacity to generate a kilowatt hour. The second is actually creating that kilowatt hour, the energy component. And the last are ancillary services, which are to ensure the reliability of your electricity. Things like spinning reserves and imbalance and losses are examples of ancillary services. Next, we have under transmission, we have building the transmission capability. So again, building the transmission that moves that power from your generator to your customer load center. But we also have connection charges, which is connecting generators to the transmission grid and connecting load centers to the transmission grid. Within the scope of the unbundling tariff, the wheeling tariff, we assume that connection charges are covered in an alternative tariff or alternative cost structure. With delivery, you also have connection charges. These are charges for your individual customers to connect to your to your delivery grid. And then there's also the capacity within the grid to move that electricity from the transmission system to your individual customers. Any questions on the way that we're thinking about unbundling?
Margot, this is Paul Chernick. I'm just curious about a couple of terminology items. One is, when you say wheeling, do you mean transmission?
Yes.
Okay, because the actual wheeling transaction involves carrying power over both transmission and distribution. So
fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you say that there's use the term service driver, does that mean load?
It can be. So service driver is either load or capacity. And so we like to think about in the rate design space, as you know, we try to understand what's the driver of the cost, and the cost may not be load. It may not be a kilowatt hour. It may be a kW. It may be a customer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So. Okay, but you're not wheeling customers, you're wheeling capacity, you're wheeling energy. So those are the service drivers that you're talking about for the wheeling, right? And when you talk about the service driver center, do you mean like the distribution substation to which the transmission delivers power?
I'm sorry, where are you seeing that exactly?
In the wheeling. Orange wheeling block up at the top, reliable delivery of energy to service driver center.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's a typo. That should be load center.
Okay, got it.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
I think I understand. And one other thing, under the wheeling connections group, you have connections of transmission system to transmission grid. I didn't see anything explicit in the rest of the discussion about charging ESPs for that specifically.
Right. So under the connect, we talk about connecting generators to the grid and connecting the distribution system to the transmission grid. And so presumably the ESP has a generator that needs to be connected to the transmission level grid. We're not really contemplating there being a generator in the delivery system, and you'll see as we talk about the participants in the different parts, you'll notice that. But we presume that connection charges are met through a connection charge tariff, and it's very important for that tariff to be solidified as well as we start talking about unbundling. Right. Because if a cost of connections is not covered in the connections, it finds itself into the other parts. Yeah. And so depending upon how deep those connection charges are is a very important concept that we need to solidify.
Right. So that's a good point. So that takes care of the first dot point. And when you say that's $1 per customer, you mean dollar per generator, which would be based on the cost of connecting that generator, right? That's not per recipient of power.
That's fair. I think of the generators as customers of
That's
PREPA as well.
fine.
Yes,
It's just
yes,
a different
exactly.
kind of customer.
Yep,
And then
fair
the
point.
second dot point under that is something about $1 per customer charge for connections of the distribution system to the transmission grid.
Mhm.
Is that supposed to mean something in particular?
So a lot of times there's costs that are incurred to actually connect the load center. And so you want to make sure that the costs to collect the load center to the grid are captured correctly through, and typically what you'll see in a fully unbundled structure is that the distribution company pays the transmission company for that cost, and that flows into the distribution company's cost of service. So we're just trying to, again, be very mindful about separating everything out. This may not be exactly how it works in Puerto Rico, but it's important to understand how these pieces come together, because what is a cost in one of these sectors or unbundled services ends up being a transfer to the other. So delivery buys wheeling, for example, and the connections for their customers. Does that make sense?
Yes, vaguely, but what I'm a little bit puzzled by is the idea that there's $1 per customer charge for the distribution substation, which I take it is your connection of distribution to transmission. And it seems like that's just part of the load-related distribution system. So if this particular dot point doesn't go anyplace, I'm fine. I just wanted to make sure that this wasn't an important thing I was missing.
Where it comes into play is understanding that there's a cost that the delivery side of the business incurs to connect to the grid, and it's a cost driven by. It may not be driven by load, it may be driven by reliability. So there's a lot of nuances here that we're trying, and again, what we're trying to do here is create a structure that is resilient and persistent over time. And so what we're basically saying here is that the transmission company will incur costs to connect the delivery a delivery load center. The delivery load center then has the responsibility, quote unquote, to recover that cost, because just like the generator paid to connect to the grid, the load center paid to connect to the grid, and that cost flows in, and that becomes a cost to the distribution side, not to the transmission side. And that's why we're making the distinction, because ultimately those dollars should be paid for by any tariffs that are related to your delivery system. Is that helpful?
Okay, so the $1 per customer there really means $1 fixed dollar cost for a delivery system.
It ultimately could, and it depends on how the connection charges. And the part of the reason we say $1 per customer under connections, particularly at the transmission level, is that they are one-off. They are very unique. It rarely is it the same cost to connect everybody to your transmission system. So it's also meant to sort of distinguish the fact that there's this uniqueness to your wheeling connections. Customer connections on the delivery side can be a little bit more generic, but it's not always the case. When you have large customers on your delivery system that are connecting, that can create significantly more connection charges than an average. Does that work? You help?
Yeah, I as enjoyable as it is to drill into these slides, I think I'd better let you get back to.
No worries. It's important because, again, like I said, this is a framework, and so as you're asking these questions, you're testing the framework, and so that's great. So moving on to the next slide, what we want to do is just quickly talk about we've covered this. This is the actual calculation of marginal costs. So step 1 and 2 are about those. So we're going to move into now, how do you think about these buckets of costs? So we've talked about the supply, capacity, and energy, wheeling, capacity, and connections. Now let's drill down one step further into that. And what we're doing here is, you'll notice, and let's just focus on the supply side right now, so the green boxes. You'll notice we have capacity costs, and what we're now talking about are the cumulative costs related to creating capacity to serve customers. And then we also have energy costs. Again, the total revenue requirement to actually create a kilowatt hour. So capacity costs revenue requirement includes two things. It includes costs that you have already incurred to build the system that you have in place that you still need to recover. And then the second piece are costs that you may incur in the future, or the incremental costs that you would incur in the future to serve incremental load. So we've broken it out into this concept of marginal and residual. And so marginal costs, you calculate marginal costs first. This is the exercise that we went through with you at the last time we met. And you actually quantify that marginal cost per kilowatt of incremental generation, and then you assume that you charge every customer that marginal cost for their use of the system. And what is left over is the difference between your total revenue requirement and your marginal cost, is what we call the residual. And the reason we distinguish it this way, and some utilities don't. Some utilities calculate marginal costs and then scale their marginal cost to their revenue requirement. We want to distinguish it this way because the residual cost is that important piece that we have to be able to quantify and make sure it's collected from all customers, that you don't end up with this shifting of costs from a customer who leaves the system to a customer who stays with the system. And that's why the residual bucket is so important. And the same is true for energy. Now, energy is interesting because energy, the marginal cost, a lot of people can interpret the marginal cost as that incremental kilowatt hour, the cost of that incremental unit coming online and operating. But we have to remember that, as with most utilities, there are contracts that have been signed that are what we frequently call take or pay, or must take, or have generation resources that are must run. And what this means is that there's costs that no matter how many kilowatt hours your customers consume, you still have those costs to create that kilowatt hour. And so there are indeed residual costs associated with energy. Stepping through the other buckets, the same thing holds for wheeling and delivery, or transmission and delivery. You have your capacity costs of building your transmission system, which are new costs associated with that, and then and the delivery system, and then there's a residual. And then, of course, with connections, there's incremental costs, and then there's ongoing O&M sometimes with those. Typically, you try to recover all your connection costs through the connection charge. So one of the things that you'll notice about the residual is it will probably end up being those costs that are not collected through your connection charges. And as I mentioned earlier, they find their way back into either the transmission or the delivery cost. There also are some costs associated with meter to cash that are incremental, but most meter to cash costs are fixed in nature, meaning that you have billing systems that you've built. So whether you have 100 customers or 1 million customers, you still have to have a billing system. Hopefully it scales from 100 to 1 million. And you have other costs that are fixed, such as call centers. But there are some marginal costs. As you have more customers, you may need more personnel to man your call centers, more trucks to roll, and so on. Any questions on the further segmenting and the differentiation between marginal and residual? So as you can see, this
Margo, just
yeah.
one thing on that last point about the cash, meter to cash. The number of meters that you need and the number of meter readings that you have to do and the number of bills you have to send out all depend on a number of customers, right? They
do, but the billing system usually is not that driven by number of customers. Metering is interesting. So it depends on, usually the meter installation is a one-time charge that happens and can sometimes be embedded in the connection charges, but certainly meter maintenance and meter replacement is more of a function of number of customers.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So this is an important slide because this is sort of the foundation of the entire rate unbundling. And so now the exercise is figuring out what dollars go into, if you kind of think of these as buckets. I like to think of it as, because I'm old fashioned, those old mail slots that we used to have when you would go pick up your mail and there are just a bunch of holes and you would sort your mail. And this is all about kind of sorting your dollars now and putting them into the right buckets. And then as you look at each of these individual buckets, one of the fundamental things you'll be asking yourself is, how should I charge for that cost to my customer? The other reason it's important is in cost allocation. So a lot of utilities will go through a cost of service exercise and derive allocation factors from that exercise. We're taking a slightly different approach because we want to create the transparency and we understand the complexity and the data uncertainty issues. And so what we do is we actually come up with a rate for each one of these buckets. So we come up with a marginal cost rate, we come up with a residual cost rate. That rate is driven by that service driver we talked about earlier. And the reason we do this is because in a place like Puerto Rico where there's a lot of dynamics, if you have a tendency to focus on allocation factors can get very sticky. And so what I mean by an allocation factor is you've come to the conclusion that your residential customers should pay 65% of all your delivery costs. Well, as things shift and as you see movement in structure and capabilities and whatnot, that allocation could change. But as you move through time, there tends to be a reluctance to change those allocation factors. Case in point, I've done a lot of work in California, and I can tell you our allocation factors have been just tweaked over the last 20, 25 years. And the focus is on the allocation factor and sometimes not on the actual marginal costs. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to do this, because you are going through transition and you want to be able to see how these marginal costs are changing and therefore how they move. Plus, you have a lot of load dynamics going on. Certain customer groups are declining, but certain customer groups might increase. And so you have to be very mindful of the implications of that in your allocations as well. So this framework helps you with the ease and transparency around allocation of costs. Any questions on that? Okay, moving on to the next slide. So fundamentally, after we address the costs, the net marginal costs, the next question in unbundling in such a way that you can offer ability for a customer to accept supply from an alternative supplier, you need to identify avoided costs. Avoided costs don't always equal marginal costs. And the reason for that is that avoided costs really means that the utility doesn't incur that cost and probably won't incur that cost. So one of the challenges that you have in your sector right now, and this is very common as you're unbundling, is the concept of provider of last resort. And what we mean by that is that every customer has a right to receive electricity, and their ultimate choice of delivery of that electricity is PREPA. PREPA will always stand by and be ready to serve that customer. And at least that's the assumption that we have right now. In any unbundled market, you will see that there is a provider of last resort. Most often, it is the incumbent utility. In some jurisdictions, however, that polar obligation has been contracted out and is a separate offering. This is very important because what it means is that customers may come and go. And as they come and go, that impacts what PREPA needs to do. And particularly in the long haul, where PREPA is preparing to make sure that all of its customers have reliable and safe power, they have to do so holistically to the system. And it's very difficult to differentiate then, okay, am I building this kilowatt hour for what I expect my customers to be, or am I making sure that I have enough capacity? There's a responsibility in the planning of the grid to make sure that the grid has the capacity that it needs. When you have third-party suppliers coming in, they are a part of that equation, but the roles and responsibilities have to be solidified. And this is where you get into things like, for example, ancillary services. So is a generator responsible for making sure that they have reserves, or are reserves provided by by PREPA? Is there going to be a market for some of these ancillary services? So these are all some of these questions that, as I said at the get-go, that we have to be able to address and understand to truly understand what will be avoidable. Because you can say, well, PREPA doesn't have to build another KW generation, so let's go ahead and take that cost and have that be part of a credit that goes to a customer that goes to another energy supplier. But if that energy supplier is no longer able to serve that customer, then that capacity cost still remains. You don't avoid capacity costs. You don't avoid energy costs as an island. You don't avoid electricity capacity costs or energy costs because customers choose to be supplied by somebody else. It's only if the customer reduces their consumption do you actually avoid the capacity as an ecosystem. So again, that's one of the things that you have to be very careful about here. Any questions on the concepts between avoided and marginal costs?
Margot, on that last point that you were discussing about the provider of last resort, is your concern that the ESP will go out of business, or that the generator will fail permanently, or what is the thing that would require PREPA to do something, to have some kind of special reserve to replace the wheeling?
It's not so much that it's a special reserve, it's that the cost is not avoided. So let me give you an example. And by the way, it could be that the ESP just defaults and the generator is now available for somebody else to use, or that the generator fails. In the case where the generator is still available, but that customer is no longer buying that electricity, somebody has to incur a cost to pay for that generator. In other words, the minute the generator gets built, it now is a residual cost. If PREPA ends up in the situation where they actually have to go and buy that, they have increased their residual by the amount that they potentially had already credited back for the avoided, if that makes sense. So what's happening is at the minute you build something, it moves from the avoided to the residual bucket. But it means that it's not avoided anymore. And that's the fundamental issue with the ecosystem concept, is that when I'm talk about the ecosystem, is that kilowatt hour gets built, it's not avoided, and somebody could eventually end up picking that up. And what happens is what you don't want to have happen is this scenario where an ESP builds a generator, thinks that they're going to charge customer X for it. Customer X decides, I don't want to pay for it anymore. The generator defaults. That generator then gets woven into PREPA's ecosystem, and now every customer on PREPA is now paying for that cost. That's a cost shift. That was a cost that was incurred. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. You're assuming that a wind farm that suddenly no longer has a customer will be able to turn to PREPA and demand that PREPA pay its full costs? as opposed to saying, we've got the wind farm, we'll take whatever we can get for the power?
Well, at some point, still PREPA is paying for whatever they get for whatever that is, ultimately, is what I'm saying.
And if they pay for that at their avoided cost, then there's no additional cost from picking up that generator to serve the additional load, right?
But now it's an avoided energy cost, not an avoided capacity cost.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Mark LaBelle here. Doesn't it depend on sort of the future regulatory framework under which this new generation is being built, that it only moves to a residual cost if you're assuming it's in a sort of traditional rate-based revenue requirement model, right?
Residual doesn't necessarily lead itself to rate base. It just, what we mean by residual is it's paid for, it has to be paid for. And so it's not about a financial structure. It's about the fact that the cost is now an embedded cost.
Well,
yeah, go ahead,
but in many market-based generation regions, there's no guarantee. When a merchant power plant gets built, there's no guarantee that they make their money back, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay.
Yep. But I do want to highlight what you said there, Mark, which is that again, you're kind of highlighting what the market rules are, and how that creates how the uncertainty around the market rules may create some uncertainty around where these costs end up going and what ends up being residual versus embedded. Okay.
Fair enough for now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next. So, there's also costs, potential incremental costs. And what we mean here is that not all generators are created equal. Some generators require more support in the form of ancillary services. So there's potentially incremental costs. And these incremental costs could be on not just the generation side, but also on the transmission side, where you are creating additional costs that the grid has to accommodate. In a lot of regimes, these incremental costs can be captured through the connection charges that we just talked about, but there's always the risk that there might be some incremental costs on the poles on the transmission system as well. The other thing to think about here is, again, a market rule issue, which is you have a potential scenario here where a generator, and let's use, Paul, your example of a wind farm. So a wind farm comes online, and that wind farm sells their power directly to an individual customer. The wind farm will not have a steady flow of electricity. In other words, trying to match the electricity of the generator from a wind farm will not match the generation of an individual customer. It's very unlikely. And so what has to happen is that there has to be other generation supply out there that will back up that wind farm when it's not operating or when it's not generating electricity. Depending upon the structure of that, how those generation resources, there may be additional burdens to need to build additional capacity to meet the variability of supply. An excellent example of this happens to be solar, where you end up at a point where some generation, where solar generates during the day. It might be quite effective on an aggregate basis of meeting load during the day, but when the sun goes down, the power shuts off. There's certainly supply out there to meet it, but the supply to meet that transition from when the sun is setting to when generators are operating requires systems that can respond very, very quickly to load. And these very flexible assets have different characteristics and different costs. Batteries are a good example of a resource that does that well. So we have to make sure that as we're bringing these resources in, and there's the supply that's coming into the ecosystem, it needs to be integrated, and the cost of that integration needs to be specifically understood, identified, and then assigned, such that the customers who are staying with PREPA are not paying for these incremental ramping resources that they are not necessarily benefiting from. Any questions there? I think PREP has already recognized that there might be marginal meter to cash costs in the structure that they have outlined in the previous orders, in that there should be some fees that the ESP pays, because even though meter to cash applies specifically to the PREPA's customers, it will then also apply to the ESPs as they become, as I said earlier, kind of a customer of PREPA as well, who needs to be billed and collected from and have meter reading requirements. All right, moving on to the next slide. These slides are basically talking about rate design and cost calculations. So I'm going to skip over them and get right to sort of how this comes together. As I mentioned earlier, our stepwise process is understand your costs, allocate them into these various different buckets, determine that service driver, and then create what we call a cost reflective rate that that can be applied to your individual customer classes. Just because you have a cost reflective rate that maybe is based off of system coincident peak doesn't mean that the end user ends up paying that rate. It just is a means of allocating costs to that customer class. So this is the nuance that I was talking about. And so instead of creating allocation factors, you're creating these cost reflective tariffs. So you're creating a lot of transparency around the cost per customer, the cost per KW, the cost per KWH, and then those costs get allocated to the individual customer classes based off of their contribution to that cost per. It's how we always do it. It's just what we're doing is creating the transparency around the capacity rate as opposed to doing it sort of behind the scenes and creating allocation factors. What this also does is it helps you understand too how you actually want to charge your customers and what you charge them for. So it creates a structure by which you can now, quote, unbundle. So moving on to the next slide, what you'll see is the same stack of costs. And I've divided them into three. The first are what we'll call general service costs. These are the costs that every customer that is connected to PREPA will have to pay. And this is why we were very careful about talking about the residuals. So you'll notice that there's the residual generation. Every customer on PREPA system should pay for that. Residual energy, avoided transmission, and residual transmission, so basically the full transmission costs, distribution, residual, and charges. You typically, because the ones at the top, the residual capacity and rates tend to be very much driven by KW or KWH, you probably move more to a volumetric rate to recover those. Volumetric rate being a kilowatt hour rate initially, but potentially a KW rate. I say initially KWH rates because the metering situation requires it individual metering to be able to go to understand demand. So you can't. It's very difficult to charge demand charges for customers without having demand meters. And then there's monthly charges. I will say, and what I mean by monthly charges, it's a fixed amount every month. The interplay between volumetric charges and monthly charges is very important because a lot of time this is where there's the art and rate design, where you may not want to charge customers a really high monthly charge that might be not palatable. There might be social and political reasons for not doing that. So you might be moving some of those costs into a volumetric charge. But from a pure rate design perspective, which is what we're presenting here, we're going to represent it as demand, as customer charges. The next column are the wheeling credits. So these are the costs that a customer would pay if they stay with PREPA, or get a credit for if they leave PREPA. And so these are the two components that really stack up to be what that export credit might be. So, excuse me, not export credit, supply credit. And then the last are wheeling charges, meaning these are costs that somebody who is actually going to a third-party supplier may have to pick up. And you'll notice they are all the incremental costs that we just talked about that are linked to the ESP. I'm going to jump to the next slide so you can see how this comes together, and then I'll pause for questions. So what we're doing now is we say what we will call full service customer receives a class general service volumetric rate, a class wheeling credit volumetric rate. So they're paying for both the cost that all customers should pay for plus the cost of the supply, equal to whatever that credit might be, and then the monthly charges. And then the wheeling customer starts with that rate, gets a credit, and then potentially pays incremental costs associated with their specific generation. We'll note that in the PREPA order, it suggests that this credit be equal to the fuel cost adjustment and the purchase power adjustment. This is, we have to be careful here, because those costs include must take, and what that means is that PREPA has to pay that a supplier. They have a purchase power agreement, for example, that they have to pay a supplier for the power that they receive, and they have to take the power. They can't turn down the power. And so what happens is that those costs, those individual costs that have been incurred on behalf of all customers, will still be incurred. You can consider them residual. If those costs are out of market, in other words, if any of those PPAs are more expensive than, say, the incremental marginal cost in any given hour, you end up having cost shifts, because those PPAs were entered into on behalf of all customers, and now a customer departs, that customer is partially responsible for the cost of that PPA. So you want to make sure that the wheeling credit doesn't create that cost shift. This has been a real issue in a lot of markets that have gone into an unbundled state with supply choice. So it's a very, very important issue, particularly when you still have an incumbent utility that has a portfolio of assets. A lot of times what you'll see is a transition where that issue of the existing portfolio gets resolved, and then everything is done at market, and that works very well. But you need that transition. And from what we can see from the structure, that transition is still being worked through. So a lot of caution on using those specific cost elements as the determination of the credit. I'll pause here for any questions.
So if this comes up later, you can say so. The structure of the rates here does this envision a change in baseline rate design for all customers, even those who are not adopting wheeling?
We're not redesigning the rates for customers, for all customers. I think this framework allows you to understand how you might want to, but that's not part of what we're going to be proposing on May 10th. What we're proposing on May 10th is this structure and this basis for determining what costs go to individual customer and individual customer classes. And so you can kind of think, even though we sort of have these as volumetric rates and customer charges, you can also think of them as kind of buckets of costs. that have to be collected. So again, like I said, the monthly charge, you might be fluctuating on that. You may not want the total amount to be a demand charge. You may want part of it to be a volumetric charge because of acceptability to your customers and whatnot. But I think the only thing that you'll see is, whether or not the wheeling credit is a demand-based credit or a volumetric credit. And I think at this stage, given the maturity of the data, I don't see how you're going to be able to move away from a volumetric credit at this time, but you certainly can redesign that in the future.
So Margot, did your answer mean that the rates would stay the same for all customers, except that there would be credits or surcharges for specific wheeling services?
That's the structure that we're seeing. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not like you're going to move to a much larger customer charge for wheeling customers.
No.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Unless there's a warrant for it, and right now I don't know that there is. I'll also say that some of these costs may not be costs that the customer pays PREPA for. Some of these costs may, so for example, if we just flip back to the previous slide, I'll emphasize this point. Right now, we're saying these incremental generation and rates, these costs are costs that have to be paid. Whether or not you ask the ESP to pay these versus asking your customer to pay them is another question, and part of the market, some of the market structure issues that we want to make sure we resolve. Just wanted to emphasize that point, so we can move forward through. So we've kind of walked you through the framework. Now we're going to walk you through a couple of findings and then some challenges that we've identified, which I've sort of spoke to. So first, we do have the previous slide real quick. These are very preliminary numbers. Again, just to show you that we've done the work around the capacity costs and the marginal energy costs. But again, in Puerto Rico in particular, the past is not reflective of the future. So a lot of the work that you do in identifying your embedded costs is very uncertain right now. So even though we have numbers, there's a lot of caution around these numbers. And we're not proposing, for example, that these marginal energy costs are indeed the credits that might flow through. We're just noting that this is what the data is showing us at this point. Yeah.
Excuse me. In the bottom table, sorry.
Yep,
previous,
go ahead.
Should that be the bottom table? Should that be megawatt hours, and kilowatt hours, cents per kilowatt hour, for example, on that?
It should be, demand should be, yeah, it's the sum of hourly demand. So the label was it was a megawatt label, but when we aggregated it is indeed megawatt hours. Thank you. Good point. They should be all per hour. Yes.
Okay. So fair enough.
Yeah.
Did you do a simple comparison of, say, 2020's 2021 marginal energy costs with the purchase power cost adjustment and fuel cost adjustment?
Not yet. We haven't done that comparison. We're still doing some testing on how the impacts on the rates are.
And are those marginal energy costs from the IRP runs, or are those from analyses that Guidehouse has done, or where did
no, these are from the Aurora runs that come from PREPA. And so again, I will emphasize there's a lot of uncertainty on what these are as well, in part because you have a lot of uncertainty around what load is going to be. There's some fairly aggressive load reduction forecasts going on, pretty dismal, to be honest. And so these costs are driven a bit by that. Your resource stack and the timing of how new generation may repairs and so on. There's a lot of retirements and replacement going on the grid. The timing of all of that creates a lot of volatility, and you can even see it in the numbers, showing a great deal of variability. I will note these are also calendar year numbers, so they won't directly tie to anything that you'll see with the FAC and other adjustment, because those are on fiscal year. So,
and in the marginal capacity cost calculation, in the report that you file in May, will that identify the projects and the costs?
Yes.
For the restoration resilience?
Yes.
Okay.
And part of the reason why you see low dollars per kilowatt hour on restoration and resilience is because the denominator there is total load. And the reason for that is that the driver of that cost is all customers, not just incremental.
Okay, but the dollar per kW wouldn't actually be used anywhere, would it? It's for transparency and a potential for allocation of residual. Okay.
So,
and is it Guidehouse's opinion that none of these additions would be avoided, even if a significant amount of capacity were of customer load shifted over to ESPs?
We're not in a position to understand and judge PREPA's resource plan. Certainly, with the load growth, the negative load growth we're seeing, it's not surprising to me that we see zero marginal costs in the load growth sector. And this is actually based off of planned. Again, there might be some volatility here, depending upon how the market structure actually comes together. So the other thing I want to note here that we still have to get our arms around as a sector in Puerto Rico is that there are costs associated with retiring assets. There are policy-related costs. So let me be very specific about that. I'm not completely familiar with some of the policy around renewables, but I do understand that Puerto Rico has a desire to move towards more decarbon or non-carbon emitting resources in their value stack. That's a policy decision. It's also a good economic decision, just a little commentary there. But it's still a policy decision. And so what still has to be decided too is, how do you think about that as a regulator? How do you implement that policy? Is every single customer responsible for making sure that a certain percentage of their load is covered by renewable resources? Does that mean that the ESP has to meet certain renewable criteria as well? Or is it done more holistically across the sector, where PREPA is responsible for making sure that the generation mix, the carbon content of your generation mix, is declining according to your targets, and charges all customers for that, therefore socializing the policy costs? What you absolutely want to avoid is a situation where these policy costs are incurred and they're flowing just to customers that PREPA has and not to these customers who have departed. So that's another structural issue that, as we've been talking about, drives what these costs can be.
Okay. Oh, one more question on the table. In the resilience row, the net present value is greater than the sum of the annual listed values. Does the NPV include additional years, or is there a typo there, or what?
I'll need to check that. I can't tell you off the top of my head. I suspect that the 2024 number might be a typo, but we'll get back to you on that. Thank you. Moving on to the conclusions. Oh, one last thing. I did want to cover this slide, because one of the things we talked a lot about at the last technical workshop was the use of proxies. And so I wanted to be clear that thus far, in sort of the marginal cost analysis and things like that, we actually do have actual numbers. Again, I find them to be very uncertain, and a lot of potential decisions and around sector could change that. But when it comes to actually allocating costs to the customer classes, it starts to get a little uncomfortable because we don't have, for example, metering at the level where we can tell you what the residential sector peak demand is necessarily or directly. You do it through sampling and things like that. So what we've had to do from a proxy perspective is we've relied on the information from the IRP. So the IRP came out with load factors and coincident factors for each customer class. And so we have translated that to, so we have actual forecasts in terms of megawatt hours by class. But in order to allocate some of these costs that are capacity driven, we need to come up with capacity numbers. And so we have calculated coincident and non-coincident peak values by customer class using these load factors and coincident factors. And so that's a proxy methodology that I just wanted to highlight, that you'll be seeing that as we allocate these costs among the classes. Any questions on that? Okay, let's go ahead and move into the findings and challenges. So finding number one, and as you just saw on the previous slide, and as you heard from us before, the marginal cost for generation is 0. This means that any kind of a generation credit that is created really results in or is going to be reflective of fuel and O&M. So marginal energy costs will drive what that number is. But what the framework does is the framework acknowledges that there may at some point be capacity costs that could be avoided, and there's a placeholder for that in the structure. So right now in that structure, that placeholder, that place has a value of 0 in it, but you can eventually put a future value into that. We want to note too that there's some interesting aspects about the costs that get incurred, with the marginal costs that are being incurred around restoration and resilience. So the first thing to think about is restoration is about returning an asset to its former capabilities, by and large. There may be a few instances where a generation capacity might be improved, but generally speaking, restoration costs are replacing or making sure that that asset returns back to its useful life. Those costs can be kind of thought of as one-time, because the embedded cost of that resource, the depreciation of that resource and whatnot, is already baked into rates. So you can kind of think of these restoration costs as one-time, so they look a little bit more like expense. This is important because then when you start to look at resilience, and this is a question we've been getting a few times about how do you handle the FEMA versus the PREPA funded assets. So resilience are really system upgrades. These are capital costs that are designed to improve the grid, and at some point that equipment that you've installed will have to be replaced. So we believe you should continue to think about those costs in terms of not just the O&M that they create, but depreciation, so that you continue to have, as you're calculating your buckets of costs. And this is a residual cost, but that you're taking into account that potential depreciation. When it comes to, though, because the fact that all costs are either funded by FEMA grant or through cash balances from PREPA, at this point in time, there's no access to capital markets for PREPA. So there's no need to create a return on some of these capital. So that return on capital right now for the investments that we see in the plan is assumed to be zero. At such point that PREPA starts to have access to capital markets and starts to fund capital through debt or other capital means, you will start to see those costs roll into your revenue requirement. So I wanted to specifically address the FEMA issue because I know that had been a question previously. All right, moving on to the next slide. We found a few challenges that I've sort of touched on. The first is, really being able to do a detailed embedded costs and creating linkages between revenue requirement is pretty messy, and that's in part because there's I'm not sure this is something that's been settled or what, again, an uncertainty about the fact that rates are frozen. Rates are set today based off of what the cost of service was and the embedded costs and revenue requirement in 2017. But as I understand it, budgets are then based off of that rate times your number of customers. So what that basically means is that you have a lot of uncertainty as to what the pie is, the size of the pie that you have to collect from customers. So, fortunately, by establishing the unbundling framework that we've did, it can persist over the next decade. And as these costs are better understood, as PREPA improves its ability to track costs by function, and able to come up with future test years that are more applicable of what they will be actually experiencing, the framework still holds up when that happens. The second is the sector restructuring, which I've talked about. There's the talk about a generation company that maybe the assets that the current portfolio that PREPA has could end up there's a potential that it could end up being something separate from PREPA. Now what you've created is transfer pricing, if you will, between your grid company and your generation company. And so again, the unbundling framework can accommodate that because we've segmented the cost between what would be by a cost to a GenCo versus what would be a cost to a transmission company or a grid company. But it does create a lot of issues on understanding what those are and how that translates into rates for customers and what that translates into as far as rate credits for customers. It could be very different. How that GenCo is set up could very much drive what the actual end user customers costs are and what truly are avoided costs and who avoids those costs. So again, until some of these issues are resolved, we really have a lot of caution that should be taken into determining any kind of credits. As I mentioned earlier, the load data by group is limited. We've been able to allocate those costs, as I mentioned before, and as meter data improves over the next several years, that will also resolve itself and again folds nicely into the unbundling framework. There's still some issues around what actually is planned. I think, Paul, you were asking, what resources are where. So the question when you start talking about marginal costs, one of the fundamental parts about calculating marginal costs is you're trying to create that relationship between a cost change and a load change. If you start having timing differences about when that cost change might happen, you start to have some issues on creating that relationship. Our resolution is we used a methodology that's very forgiving for timing because we don't look at the change in cost every year relative to the change in price like a regression method might do. We're using a methodology that smooths that over time so that really the implications of time variance of project timing really becomes a minor issue related to cost of the cost of money, the value, time value of money. And then lastly, and this is something that we'll get into a little bit later, we have to understand whether or not existing generation is going to be eligible for serving customers via ESP. So is there the potential that a generator that is currently selling its power to PREPA can arbitrage and end up not renewing their contract with PREPA and using their generation to serve an ESP because their generation is lower in the value stack, meaning that when you look at the stack of resources, there's a marginal unit. They're in that stack. They're selling their power to PREPA, and that power that they sell to PREPA is less than the marginal energy cost. So it's contributing to dampening the average cost. If that generator leaves, now average cost for PREPA customers goes up. And that's another form of cost shift that we have to be leery of. Any questions on the challenges or findings around rates?
Starting with that last point, have you looked at when the IPP contracts with PREPA end and when PREPA would be facing the situation you're talking about?
Not yet. We've identified it. And what I should say, some of these challenges, when we talk about testing the rate, I want to be clear what that means. What we're doing is we're designing the rate structure in the uniform framework, and then we're asking ourselves questions about what if.
Mm-hmm.
That's the testing. And so this is one of those challenges. It may not be a significant issue, but we certainly can investigate that.
And the difference is that if a wind farm's contract with PREPA ended and there wasn't any wheeling, then the wind farm would have a choice of selling to PREPA at whatever PREPA was willing to pay or shutting down. And with the wheeling, PREPA would be bidding against the ESPs for that power supply. Is that?
That certainly is one scenario. Again, as you are sorting out the sector rules, there are other ways that you could manage that situation.
Okay. Yeah, I was a little bit curious about your point in the resolution about developing a true-up mechanism. Are you suggesting that perhaps customers who select wheeling would be penalized for the fact that the generators that their ESP might buy from might have otherwise sold to PREPA?
So true-up mechanisms are mechanisms to ensure the mitigation, if not elimination, of unwanted cost shifts. So cost shifts can go either way, particularly in places where you have volatility happening around the value of an asset. Maybe it's because the marginal energy costs are higher because fuel costs are higher, or then they've cratered and fuel costs are really down. And so, there's these finite portfolios that PREPA has invested in. And there are residual costs associated with that portfolio. If an export credit is set based off an expectation of the value of that portfolio, for example, so assuming that, to your point, that a generator would be potentially indifferent between selling to a customer and selling to PREPA under a certain market condition, there is potential for that picture to change. And what we've seen in some markets where these exist, there's the potential for it happening where the ESP doesn't get the right amount of credit, or the credit is too much and the PREPA customers pay. Either one is bad. And so what these true-up mechanisms do, and we're not saying that you absolutely need a true-up mechanism. We're saying that there's enough uncertainty right now that that you may want to use some true-up mechanisms as you transition to make sure that you're not shifting costs one way or the other. It's about again, borrowing on my California roots, it's about creating indifference and making sure that customers, both customers who leave and customers who stay, are made whole.
Well, I believe that the power cost and difference adjustment, I think, is a California term, correct?
It is.
But do you have jurisdictions in mind when you're talking about this particular issue? Perhaps
well, certainly, we can look at California, and we can see that that there's a lot of concern around this very issue with respect to customer choice on supply, and it's in part a residual of the idea that you still have this entity that has generation assets that that they have invested in, and the resolution of those assets and that portfolio that was incurred on behalf of their customers hasn't been fully resolved. And that's the part that creates the need for these transition these mechanisms, is that you're moving from a state of affairs today to a new state of affairs. There's uncertainty on actually how that all kind of works itself out. Once you get to that future state, a lot of these theories about how you would charge customers and create credit is very valid. But when you're in a transition state like you are, it's very important to put safeguards in to make sure that you don't end up with these cost shifting issues.
Well, and
go on, Mark.
No, I mean, and one issue is whether whether any or all of these issues are first order effects, or whether they're effectively rounding errors in the broader transition.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't really know that yet, though, to be honest. Paul, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did, and I just want to make sure I understand what you're talking about with true-up mechanism. Do you mean that at some point that it may be appropriate for the board to institute a mechanism to update some values so that either new customers moving on to wheeling in future years or would face a different price than the earlier ones, or that a customer who was charged one set of prices or an ESP that was charged one set of prices in 2023 might face a different set of prices in 2024 due to a true-up? Or are you talking about actually going back and charging customers retroactively for or crediting them for over/under collection of some sort?
So we haven't designed the true-up mechanism, in part because we don't know what the market rules are yet. But you could say all of the above or none of the above. I am not a huge fan of vintage pricing. It's incredibly complex from a billing perspective, and it works okay when you have mass exodus of customers moving from one entity to another. But when you're talking about individual customers and they might be bouncing from ESP to ESP or from the ESP back to PREPA, vintage pricing gets hairy. What I am suggesting, though, that these true-up mechanisms are backward looking but forward charging, which is how you would typically do this. And you can think of it in the sense that you looked back, you realized that there were these cost charged that shouldn't have been, that maybe were overcharged to one group or another, and then you circle that back through a series of riders on your rates going forward. So there's a rider component. You could do the rate design and a rider functionality so that you can either add a rider to the export credit or and add the rider to the general to the non to the PREPA customers. That's not perfect, because what happens is that you're going back in time and you're looking and you're saying, okay, these 100 customers paid too much, and then you're doing your best to give back to those 100 customers, but you may not give back exactly to each customer what they could have gotten, what they overpaid.
Right. Yep.
So
that's true for any reconciliation mechanism, I think.
That's
okay,
right.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. On challenge number 4, you talk about basing the marginal cost estimates on PREPA's 10-year plan. The marginal cost examples that you gave us were based on 4 years.
Yes.
In the final report, will you have a 10-year version of that, or?
So we're using the 10-year plan through 2024. We are working on getting some additional forecasted data to see if we can use all 10 years of the plan. And then we're also running some sensitivities around, mostly around the demand forecast, so that you can see how sensitive these marginal cost estimates are to that demand forecast. Because as I mentioned, it's pretty alarming. And while I'm not going to challenge it and say it's wrong, I think it's good to understand the sensitivity to it. So we will test that. Anything else on this? Is it? Are people wanting to take a break, or should we muscle through? How does this normally work? I'm okay to keep going, but I'm just offering. I don't know where everybody else is.
I think we can just continue.
Okay.
Later, if we need a break, maybe we can take a 5-minute break, but just as of now, please continue.
Okay. Yeah, it's just a good break time. So that's because we're going to transition now from the unbundling tariff to the uniform services agreement. I will take a sip of water, though. Move on to the next slide, please. Okay. So here, as I mentioned earlier, we also have a 10-step process for the universal services agreement. That really kind of walks you through the types of things that we have to be thinking about and challenging ourselves on as we think about what this agreement looks like. At the end of the day, what we're proposing is that what we file in the May 10th filing is what I would call a term sheet, which basically outlines the fundamental aspects and components of a uniform services agreement. But all the legalese has not been baked in. That's something that needs to be, I think, done through a more deliberate process than just us, than just a filing. Excuse me. And also, what you'll notice as we think through this, that we're thinking about all of the types of things that need to be considered as you create these differentiations for services. Whether or not they end up being a uniform service agreement between what I will call the grid side of the business to the ESP, or whether it's something that has to be done between maybe the generation side of the business and the ESP. I think there's enough uncertainty around exactly how that structure is going to work to warrant caution as you think about what goes into a universal wheeling agreement versus perhaps other agreements. Moving on to the next slide. The first thing we wanted to do is, going back to our unbundled picture, where are there players? Who's playing in these various different markets and participating in these various different markets? So you can see when it comes to supply, a generator is providing capacity, energy, and potentially ancillary services. While an ESP is the function of the quote unquote ESP will be to provide capacity and energy to their customer. They don't necessarily provide ancillary services directly. We put the customer in here because there's always the potential for self-generation. And so we wanted to be clear where that happens, and it's basically a customer is providing their own energy and supply, which means they're effectively wheeling to themselves and they're delivering to themselves with their self-generation. We are not including issues around self-generation in the Uniform Services Agreement. Self-generation and rules around self-generation are a whole nother topic, and they create different kinds of cost shifts on how they're handled. So we want to make sure that doesn't muddy the waters with respect to wheeling. But we wanted to at least acknowledge the fact that customers can be suppliers. ESPs can also bill, and it is our intention, and you'll see this in the service agreement, that the ESP actually is billing for their costs. PREPA serves the entire spectrum, again, in part because they are the provider of last resort. But they have different functions across that, which is designated here. Any questions about the providers of bundled services? Okay, moving on to the next slide. Here what we want to talk about is the operating model, and this is just so that we can create some some clarity, excuse me. And we'll just follow the numbers here as you see them. So step one, ultimately and this is also where we're clarifying some of our assumptions. So there is an entity that must plan for the system, the sector, to make sure that there's ample generation, transmission, and distribution capacity and services that are reliable. Right now, PREPA has that role. And so there are investments being made to ensure the recovery of your system and the future resiliency of your system that are in play. Number two is over on the right-hand side by the house. So the second step is that you have a customer that connects to this grid. So PREPA's made the grid available. The customer connects to the grid, and as I showed in the unbundling structure, that customer pays to have themselves connected to that grid. Number three is over by the ESP. And it's about the ESP connecting to PREPA. So it's connecting that generator to PREPA. And again, those costs of connections are covered in connection charges. So now everybody's connected, and you have this customer number one, and you have an ESP number one. Now ESP number one then decides that they want to become, they're actually a generator, they want to become an ESP. So they, at step 4, sign the Universal Services Agreement. So they are signing that, saying, we want to be an energy service provider. And that's effectively what we're going to be talking about here. But so they've signed up, and that means that they have qualified under all of the terms and conditions set out in a services agreement. At that point, the ESP can go out and start marketing. They recruit customer number one, and the customer signs them up to be their service provider. The ESP then needs to notify PREPA that customer number one will now be receiving supply from the customer. And this is all covered as well in the language of the order that requires the ESP notification. Once the customer has converted, now the ESP is responsible for supplying. So they generate electricity amount A and deliver it to PREPA's system at point 7. PREPA then on the other end, PREPA is connected to the customer, and the customer is consuming electricity B. PREPA is meeting the hourly needs of that customer. Regardless of what the ESP is supplying, the customer is moving their load around, they're turning lights on and off, and PREPA is meeting that load requirement and serving customer B. Ultimately, then PREPA, and this is an important assumption, PREPA now bills the customer for PREPA's costs. So when I walked you through the unbundling and I talked about the bill that would go to these customers, it is the total. What PREPA will charge is the total full service bill minus the generation credit. Then PREPA then goes ahead and bills the ESP for any differences between the amount generated by the ESP and the amount consumed by the customer, plus losses. So we have to account for the losses on the system. And there is also the potential for credit that the ESP provided additional power, provided more power than the customer actually consumed. So it's either a bill or a credit. Lastly, the customer pays the ESP for the supply of the electricity. So the ESP and the customer are exchanging bills. We're making the assumption that PREPA is not the bill collector for the ESP. And therefore, the ESP is responsible for their own collections. So these are key assumptions that we're making that do make a difference, that if you change some of these assumptions, it makes a difference, and it creates risks for either the ESP or PREPA. Any questions on the operating model?
Do you want to elaborate at all on that last choice of?
Sure.
I would assume that PREPA would be concerned about getting paid and not facing the risk of an ESP taking off with money owed to PREPA. Mm-hmm. So do you know whether PREPA has a preference for doing the billing jointly and passing along to the ESP its fees minus whatever PREPA is charging to the ESP?
Yeah, we haven't talked about that in the context of a service that it's certainly a service that PREPA could offer, but it does create credit risk in that the ESP is relying upon PREPA to collect that money and pay them. Conversely, if the ESP, as you said, the ESP, let's say the ESP doesn't collect anything from the customer, and all that, and maybe the ESP didn't deliver all the electricity, now PREPA has a risk to them. We'll be talking a little bit more about that when we get into kind of the credit and collateral requirements defined under the Universal Services Agreement.
And what happens if a client pays just PREPA and not the ESP, or just one of them, or ESP and not PREPA? So how would be handled?
So in the situation where a customer doesn't pay the ESP for the electricity the ESP delivered, the ESP has a credit risk with that individual customer. In this design, we're suggesting that is a problem for the ESP, not PREPA. So here's a scenario that you're sort of avoiding by having the ESP charged directly. Let's say a customer receives a bill for both ESP and PREPA services of $100 and they pay $75. Mm. What's the order by which you allocate that $75? Do you give 75% of what PREPA is due to PREPA and 75% of what the ESP is due to the ESP? Does PREPA get first order? Those are some complications that you avoid by doing this. The second is an issue where if PREPA were to if the ESP did all the billing, then PREPA is dependent upon the ESB collecting that money and paying PREPA for those services, and now has increased risk to the ESP. So by having separate billing, you're sort of minimizing the amount of dollar flow that has to go between the two entities, which makes things a little bit cleaner and easier. When we talk about the credit, I'll go into this a little bit more, but I'll tap on it just a bit here. If in this part where you see PREPA bills the ESP, if the ESP doesn't pay PREPA, now PREPA has a problem. They have provided electricity to that customer, and there's the potential that for an entire month the ESP was not giving power to PREPA, and PREPA was serving the customer. Now that PREPA has actually effectively served that customer all their supply needs. In theory, what would happen was PREPA would charge the ESP for that. If the ESP is not able to pay, now PREPA is left with those additional costs. So we are suggesting some collateral requirements of the ESP to deposit with PREPA to mitigate that risk. Does that answer your question?
Yes. It's gonna be very interesting to see how it's gonna be applied.
Yeah. But you can see what we're trying to do here is the goal is trying to minimize that exposure to each other. So moving on to the next slide. This is just illustrative to talk about things like that difference between A and B and what those various different scenarios are. I'll leave this for you to review. It's just mostly trying to highlight the idea that there's a lot of variability because the ESP isn't directly connected to the load, and so there's always a chance that the ESP's load is not, or generation isn't following the load, and the system, quote, the system has to pick that up, and that's covered through imbalances. We'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. Moving on to the next issue, which has to do with congestion. Again, I'll let you all look at this, but there is the potential that the ESP's electricity cannot get to the load center because of congestion, and that means that a generation on the system has to be standing ready to supply the load center and be on what we say the right side of congestion. So there's only two ways to fix transmission congestion: build bigger lines or have generation on the side of load where the load is, so that you can meet some of your load with that generation. Moving on to the next slide. And these are all, we put these in here because there are things that we're thinking through. So one of the things that we have to be thinking about in this universal services and the operating model is, how do you handle these losses and how do you handle congestion? So we'll talk about losses first. Losses are a little bit easier because you can at least quantify, as an entity, you can quantify what your historical losses have been. You can, and there's already been a decision made earlier that a loss adder is set based off of cost of service study. That all can work. You're basically socializing the risk of losses. And you can continue with that as an operating model. More mature markets will look at losses a little bit differently, and they'll start to consider whether or not certain connectivity between certain loads and certain generators have more losses than less. And that mostly is designed to set market price signals for generators. You're a ways away from having to worry about that, in my opinion. So, we have the loss adders included as part of it. And so the services agreement will outline what the losses are. One of the important assumptions that we're making is that, and this again is to avoid financial risk, is we are suggesting that the ESP provide and supply enough electricity to cover losses. Some markets, losses are a financially settled item, meaning that you'll take the losses, you'll multiply it by some marginal cost, and you'll just charge the ESP for those losses. We don't want to create that type of risk. Losses can be quite, as I understand it, losses are pretty large on a percentage basis in Puerto Rico, not surprising given the territory and the diversity. And so you want to make sure that you're minimizing PREPA's exposure to collecting those costs. And the way you do that is requiring the ESP to provide the losses. So what happens is, let's say a customer says, I need 10 kilowatt hours in this hour, and your losses are 10%. That means your generator is generating and injecting into PREPA's system 11 kilowatt hours. Any questions on the loss adder and how it works? Okay. Next, we'll talk.
Just one little clarification, and that is that all these loss adders would be by voltage level or class or something like that. They wouldn't be customer specific. They wouldn't be generator and customer specific.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, right. If you're a transmission level customer, you should only be paying transmission losses and primary and so on. Yep.
Okay, but the loss factor for any transmission customer would be the same regardless of what generator is serving their ESP.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I meant by socializing. It's like everybody's contributing to the amount of losses equally on a per kilowatt hour basis. It's not ideal, but I also am not a huge fan of marginal losses because I sometimes wonder where the money goes in that formulation. So that's a whole nother debate. Next, we talk about congestion. So as we mentioned, there is the potential for congestion. And what that means is the scenario is as follows. You have load. The customer asks for an incremental kilowatt. The ESP goes ahead and generates that incremental kilowatt. But the transmission capacity, for whatever reason, between the ESP and that load center is constrained. And so, as I mentioned before, what that means is a different generator has to operate to fulfill the kilowatt hour obligation for that customer. As an ecosystem, it sort of works itself out in the context that if the ESP is putting a kilowatt hour on and the customer is taking a kilowatt hour off, it means that PREPA is taking that kilowatt hour and delivering it to a customer, and they're generating a kilowatt hour as well. So they could be delivering the kilowatt hour that's being generated from PREPA's machine could be going to the ESP's customer, and then the ESP's kilowatt hour could be going to to a PREPA customer, and it's all good because everything's all fine. The problem is when the kilowatt hour can't get to the customer and the generator that has to be dispatched is more expensive than the kilowatt hour that PREPA normally would have dispatched. And that's where you create congestion costs. So we are saying that there should be a congestion adder in the Universal Services Agreement. However, I will say we are a ways away from being able to do that measurement that I just described, which is really calculating the cost of that incremental generator versus the generator that would have dispatched without congestion and so on. Mark, you have a question?
Well, I would say that this raises, well, as you well know, this raises a number of broader issues. If you're doing zonal generation pricing, then that automatically reflects congestion. This is not something that's done at present for customers. Generally, it is you You can have zonal pricing and time varying pricing that is higher at times of congestion when there are higher dispatch costs. And that is not sort of baked into the baseline or reforms that will be happening in the next, say, year, I believe.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, we're saying that we can't just say there's no such thing as congestion, but we know that we're not in a position to really understanding and quantifying what congestion costs are. You're right. At the end of the day, a customer pays a quote unquote nodal price, and these issues around congestion create value or incremental cost to suppliers that then get reflected in the supply cost. So all we're suggesting is that we should have a placeholder in the Uniform Services Agreement to account for congestion, because as you mature and as you start thinking about these things that you were lining out, Mark, you have a way of incorporating that. Again, making sure that we're creating a framework for the Universal Services Agreement that is long-lasting and durable as your market transforms. Does that answer your question, Mark? Sort of.
Well, I think we agree there are important and interesting issues here.
Yeah, and I think we also agree that we don't necessarily know what they are, how they're going to resolve themselves. So yeah, go ahead, Paul.
And just to be clear, when you're talking about congestion, I mean, there's congestion for the PREPA system now. So if a customer who's in an area that's sometimes constrained and PREPA has to run some local generation that's more expensive to serve it, if they switch to an ESP, you wouldn't be proposing that they pay extra for the congestion that exists currently, but just any additional congestion that would be caused by the ESP's generation coming onto the system? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's effectively what you're doing. And again, that's because the way you do it is you really measure what it costs to deliver a kilowatt hour to that load center. And that's what the customer pays. And then, as you said, there's potential ways of determining whether or not the ESP pays for the congestion or the transmission system does. In other words, the rules haven't been finalized as to who pays for congestion. Mm-hmm. There are markets that have decided that congestion is paid for. It's at the end of the day, it's all paid for by the customer, but how it transfers around and how those costs are measured and allocated to entities is the hairy part of that problem. Yeah.
But my concern was just that you wouldn't want to wind up in a situation where a customer who's in an area that's currently congested, but those congestion costs are socialized for all of PREPA's customers. If they were to switch to an ESP, then suddenly they would be getting charged for that congestion. And however you do this mechanism, it would have to somehow be even-handed, so it wasn't either penalizing or rewarding the ESPs for or the customers based on where they happen to be.
True, although I would say that an ESP that is able to relieve congestion potentially should be rewarded for that.
But we're talking there about generation.
Yep.
That's been in a load pocket. That's
right.
More about I certainly understand that, but I'm just sort of raising the flag of congestion exists, and you want to make sure that if you're looking at a charge for wheeling, that it be for increases or decreases in congestion, not for congestion that already exists. But back to you.
And this actually brings up another issue, which can sometimes interplays with imbalance, which is that if you have a new generator come online and they're on the wrong side of the congestion, there's the potential that kilowatt hour just can't be used. it can't get to any of the load centers. And in that situation, it gets treated through imbalance, because the generator is delivering less energy to the grid because they have to be curtailed for operational reasons, and then they pay on the imbalance side. Does that make sense? Great. Sorry, the coffee making has begun in my house. It's still kind of early here on the West Coast. A little bit of coffee grinding going on in the background. So let's move on to the next slide. So the next thing we wanted to talk through is just sort of the process by which and the interplay between the ESP and the customer. So we've talked a little bit about this in the diagram of the operating model, but we wanted to really be very clear about what will be required by who. So the first step is that you really need to go through the kind of what I would call a qualification process for the ESP. It's not enough that the ESP just signs the Universal Services Agreement and says, here you go, I'm now officially an ESP. You really should have a process by which that ESP is qualified. There's a lot that goes into that, but a lot of it has to do with whether or not they can actually meet the terms and conditions of the the Uniform Services Agreement, to include things like the collateral. And so then the generator connects itself to the grid, especially if it's a new generator. They've connected themselves to the grid. We've talked about those connection costs already. And then they sign a Universal Services Agreement. The paragraph in italics is here for purposes of consumer protection. So one of the things that we want to make sure is that PREPA is aware of who is marketing ESP services in their service territory, in order to be able to advise customers if they get a phone call that says, I've just been asked to get my supply provided by Brown Power Inc. And is Brown Power Inc. an ESP? And PREPA will know, because all of the ESPs would have signed up with them, and they can confirm that, yep, Brown Power Inc. is indeed a pre-qualified, certified, whatever the term you might want to use, ESP. So again, this is not about PREPA saying you don't sign up with that customer. It's about PREPA being aware of who's out there, so that if they get inquiries, it provides that additional protection for your customers. The second is the ESP recruits the customer. So the ESP says, hey, I'm going to go and I've signed up, Factory X to become an ESP. Here's their account numbers, and I'm going to start providing service to them on X date. Again, an italicized comment here, which is a process by which the PREPA confirms with the customer that the customer has indeed decided to go with Brown Power Inc. to supply their energy, that they're not caught off guard or surprised by this, or they thought maybe they had just been talking to them and hadn't quite signed up. Again, a consumer protection. It's just PREPA notifying them that they're going to be converted to a different rate. And then the customer and PREPA switches. One of the things that's underlying this is timing. So one of the things that still has to be worked out is how long is it actually needed, and what's the timing for conversion. So, you don't want to have a situation where an ESP says, I'm supplying this customer as of tomorrow. That's an administrative nightmare, but you also don't want it to be this 90-day process that you have to go through. So there's a middle ground here that has to be agreed upon, that's reasonable. One of the things that you do like to do is to preferably stay on the customer's billing cycles. Again, that creates for cleaner transition, but it's not mandatory, but it's certainly a consideration. Now the ESP supplies the customer, they schedule day ahead power, and plus the losses, as I mentioned. And I want to note here that in our testing, we've identified the potential for an ESP to be both a supplier to PREPA and a supplier to a customer. We don't know of any market rules that have been thought through or determined that would preclude this situation. So you could have a generator that says, I have sold 50% of my power to PREPA, and I'm going to sell 50% of my power to ESPs. If that's the case, we want there to be separate scheduling because there's contract terms and conditions that have to be met with the PPA with PREPA that may be separate from the Universal Services Agreement terms and conditions. So want to make that distinction. Don't know that this scenario will ever happen, but unless you prevent it, you probably should be prepared to address it. And then, as I mentioned before in that operating agreement slide, ESP delivers the electricity on an hourly basis, and PREPA meets that customer's usage. And then finally, PREPA bills the ESP for any of the fees and charges, as well as imbalance. The ESP bills the customer for energy services, and PREPA bills the customer for services on the tariff. Any questions on these steps? Okay, moving on to the next slide. These are the fees that we think, or charges, I should say, that would probably flow through into the ESP. We've already talked about congestion charges, number 5, so we don't need to talk about that, but let's talk a little bit about 1 through 4. So starting with the ESP fees, and this has already been recognized in the order that that PREPA should be establishing fees, and the fees can have a nature of one-time, monthly, or annual to recover any of the operational costs that PREPA might be incurring to accommodate ESPs providing supply. So these are mostly administrative related costs associated with meter reading, billing, account management, data transfer. Somehow PREPA has to provide to the ESP the meter reading of their customers in an orderly and easily accessible yet encrypted way to protect your customers' personal information. And all of that has to be accounted for and done in a systematic way, and that has costs. And so that's what those costs should be. They should be cost-based, yeah, they should be cost-based. And they will probably be a function of both, by the number of ESPs, so ESP costs, and then probably a per customer cost as well. If an ESP has 10 customers, they may pay more than an ESP who has only 1 customer, as an example. Imbalance payments. So we talked a little bit about these already, and these are also considered and actually outlined in the order to be considered in the Uniform Services Agreement. So the first thing is that there has to be sort of an hourly imbalance rate established, meaning what is that cost of that kilowatt hour that gets generated to accommodate load on the margin. It also serves as the marginal cost here is it can be a pre-established rate, and it can be trued up. Or it can be a retroactive rate. Sometimes you'll see these to be actually retroactive based off of actual system lambdas and things like that. PREPA then monitors these differences between the ESP customers and the generator on an hourly basis. This might be a little bit tricky for customers who don't have hourly meters, but we still want to make sure that we account for the fact that electricity, that the imbalance rate will vary over the time of day and by season potentially, and you want to make sure that you don't create any gaming where you end up having PREPA pick up the most expensive hours for a customer, but then those costs for those most expensive hours doesn't flow through in the imbalance payment. Any positive differences, meaning that the generator, the ESP, provided more electricity to PREPA than the customer consumed, less losses. will be credited back at 95%. That's specified in the order. And any negative hourly differences will be charged at the imbalance rate. Pretty straightforward, hour by hour reconciliation. Then there's what I'm terming performance charges, and this is where we get into how well is the ESP matching their customer load. So are they meeting? Ideally, the ESP is providing enough electricity on an hourly basis such that the differences between what they supply and what the customer consumes are somewhat random. Meaning that sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative, so there's no systematic difference between those, that's ultimately what you're trying to get at here with these performance charges. So an example would be, here's an extreme bad example where an ESP is has one generation facility, and they just run that generator. Let's say it's a renewable resource, so that renewable resource is running when either the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. They're supplying ample number of kilowatt hours to cover the customer, but they're not matching the customer's load hour by hour. In that case, the PREPA is matching them hour by hour. And so what we've proposed here is consistent with the order, but is slightly different. What we're proposing that PREPA looks across the year at this hour by hour difference and sums up the hourly difference and puts that against the deadband. So there was this concept of a deadband that there will be a forgiveness that if you have cumulative deviations more than a certain percent or less than a certain percent, you're not charged additional fees. And that deadband, as put in the order, starts at somewhere around 60% and then declines over time as the market matures and as the ESPs mature. What we want to make sure we're doing here is taking the sum of the differences, so those hourly differences, rather than the difference of the sums. So I can look at the total kilowatt hours provided by a generator, and that could equal 100, and I could look at the total kilowatt hours equal to a customer, and that could equal to 100, and I can say the difference between those two is 0. There's no performance issue. But if on 50% of the hours the ESP provided 0 energy and the customer consumed energy, and on a different 50% of the hours, the ESP provided twice as many kilowatt hours as the customer intended. That sum of those differences, particularly given the timing of when those imbalances occur, are quite problematic and create a significant cost shift to PREPA's remaining customers. Let me pause there. I see a little bit of a puzzle on your face there, Paul, but let me pause here for a moment and make sure that you all followed that the concept of the sum of the differences versus the difference of the sum.
I think you're talking about the difference between absolute values and arithmetic values, and I think I'm trying to understand the rationale for your performance charges, and if you don't want to talk about that at this point, if you just want clarifications.
No, go. I mean, I can go ahead and ask your question, and okay. I can see.
Well, the way that the imbalance payments are set up in step 2, an ESP that's not matching well, providing the right amount of energy but not matching their customers' load well, will wind up paying PREPA because they only get credited 95% for their excess, but they're charged 100% of any shortfalls. Then in step 3, you're saying, and in addition to that, if you're over providing sometimes and under providing other times, we're going to charge you another 10% if you go over some deadband, and I'm wondering why both of those mechanisms would be required and justified.
Yep, good question. So it has to do with the connectivity between the the supply credit that the customer is getting and the actual imbalance costs. So in a perfect world, the export credit, the supply credit is equal to the hourly imbalance rate. So every kilowatt hour that's generated by the ESP and offered to the customer is not a kilowatt hour that the PREPA needs to generate, and so therefore the credit applies. But if the ESP doesn't provide that kilowatt hour and PREPA does, and PREPA incurs that cost, then the export credit matches up. Where you end up having here is the potential that two problems. The first is you create that disconnect between what PREPA's actual costs are that include serving these customers and standing ready to serve these customers, and what the actual export credit was. Also, it's important to from a sector perspective to make a decision about how much suppliers can lean on PREPA to be that default provider, and that translates into capacity. Imbalance markets are energy markets. They're not capacity markets. So at such time where there's capacity needs and these the PREPA has to build capacity to stand ready to meet this fluctuating demand, even because now that you have to think about this generator is now just sort of in the mix, and PREPA is matching the load following. And they have to invest in capacity potentially to do that, particularly given as we move more and more towards renewables that have that volatility. Then there's assets that have to be built to respond to that. That's the problem that you're trying to avoid. And so you put performance charges in there. You can deal with this, other ways. We are, again, as we're testing the rate. Firstly, I will note that that the concept of performance charges was in the order, so we're in part being compliant with that. But again, how the end market structure results and how you truly calculate that supply credit and what costs are in that supply credit versus the cost that PREPA would have to serve still needs to be thought through.
Okay.
So I have sort of a more overarching question. The way the order, the December order, what it asked for was it asked for a proposal based on a fairly moderately length list of concepts, right? Yeah. And then it says if PREPA wants to make an alternative proposal, they are free to do that with their consultants' help. So is that consistent with what you guys are planning? A little late if it's not, but so that's one question. The second thing is, so there's what would be helpful, assuming you are, is that we have the proposal A, and then it would be helpful in the filing to say, here are the key ways the proposal B is different, and presumably arguments in favor of those differences. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it does, and that's consistent with what we're doing here. Is I'm at least trying to be transparent that the order says X, and we're saying we're not really sure that X is enough. That maybe you need a little more.
Totally understand, and as long as there's the point of comparison, I think that would be extremely helpful. And as a lawyer, I'm perhaps overly sensitive to subtle changes in implications. But I think we're on the same page. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So can we just go back to the purpose of the performance charge?
Mm-hmm.
As it's written in the order, the performance charge basically says you can't be an ESP and lean on an annual basis, lean on PREPA to supply a large part of your load. And you can't really be just exporting power to PREPA and calling yourself an ESP. You need to be sort of matching your annual energy and demand, or else there will be some consequences, because we want you to be fulfilling that role. And if you want a different relationship with PREPA, go ahead and sign a PPA with them. Mm-hmm. But this performance charge, as you've described it, is to pay for the capacity that's necessary to back up the ESP supply, but you're not reducing capacity charges for the ESP or its customers. You're not giving any credit for avoided generation capacity. So if PREP is going to have the same generation capacity, regardless of whether customers are served by ESPs or not, why would you need to charge these fees to cover the capacity necessary for backup?
Sure. So I think there's two issues here. The first is that we are trying to set up a framework that will last decades, not months or years. And as a result, there is a potential at some point in the future where there are marginal cost credits. So you're looking at it today and you're saying there's no marginal cost credits. Everything's in the residual, isn't it already paid for? I think is the point you're making. At some point in the future, there will be a capacity related charge. Do you make sure that those capacity related charges are linked appropriately? The second is, and I like the way you phrased this, is you said, the way the order looks at it today is you're really trying to make sure that the ESP is truly an ESP and not just another generator connected to PREPA that gets paid something different than what they would if they signed a contract with PREPA. And so, the question about leaning on the system on an annual basis. What we're in part concerned about is that annualizing that reliance on the grid may not be ideal. That instead there's the potential that there are certain months where reliance on the grid especially as these are new resources coming online, that they are still not leaning on the grid annually, but perhaps monthly, which is why these fees are monthly. Well, the imbalance fees are monthly, but the look back is annual. So it's about trying to get to a further level of granularity, and the presumption that we had when looking at the declining ramp rate or the bandwidth is that there is a desire to have these generators be matching customer load and not relying on PREPA to be that balancing entity for them. And so this further incents that and creates that.
Okay, when you say it incents that, what's the purpose here? There's no other balancing entity. There's no ISO that there's no other utility system that the ESPs can draw on when their generator is down, or that it can sell to when its generator is producing more than load. Mm-hmm. So are you saying you want the generators to install storage and independently follow their customer loads, regardless of whether that's what the system needs or not?
I'm saying that I want to make sure that you don't inadvertently create arbitrage opportunities where an ESP can come in and target a portion of a customer's load and serve that load through cumulative kilowatt hours versus truly meeting that customer's needs, supply needs. So imagine a situation, we had talked about the solar, the renewable power generator, just depositing their kilowatt hours, their as generated kilowatt hours onto the grid and getting the equivalent of a fixed price firm rate from their ESP, and that firmness is coming from the firming of that power is coming from PREPA. Take a different scenario where a customer has volatile load, but a steady amount of load of, say, 10 kilowatts every hour. You have a potential that the ESP could say, I'll serve your load, and they just give 10 kilowatts every hour to PREPA. And now PREPA is meeting what we fondly call in the rate business or the energy business, the dirty load, the volatile load, and the ESP is serving at potentially much lower cost that fixed portion of the load. Remember, rates are an average of taking all of these costs of the dirtiness of load and the steadiness of load, customers with good load factors, customers with bad load factors, all that gets averaged into these credits. You start having this ability to arbitrage that certain customers are paying something different. They're getting the average benefit of their cost of service in their credit, but they are actually their individual cost of service is greater. And so that and what that ends up doing is that the inexpensive part of the service is leaving, and then that forces PREPA's average cost to go up. So it's really about it's about trying to create that incentive that you don't create these arbitrage opportunities that will inadvertently result in cost shifts to your customers.
Okay. And in the imbalance payments, if the customer's residual load on the system is high at times when system load is high and energy is expensive, then the ESP will wind up paying more to PREPA than if the customer's higher load is at some other hour when it's a lower cost to serve. So again, I just would encourage you to look back at the imbalance payments and see if there's really something that is being missed there that requires this absolute value calculation.
Okay.
But I think we probably talked about this particular point now.
We could talk about all of these things for a very long time. It's one of the most interesting projects. The last are late payments. Perhaps I missed it, but I didn't think I saw anything in the order around payment schedules and things like that. So we had to make some sort of presumption about 60 days versus 90 days. The idea here is making sure that that money due to the ESP to PREPA, and conversely money due from PREPA to the ESP for these imbalance payments and so on, is paid in a timely fashion, and then also links to kind of default terminology that has to go into the Uniform Services Agreement. At what point is PREPA allowed to draw upon the collateral to make the payments, and and forcefully terminate the ESP's Uniform Services Agreement due to late payment. These are issues that I don't, that is well beyond a rate designer's expertise. So it's something that I feel has to be addressed as we work through the legal terms. I will say I'm a former market and credit risk manager, and so I'm very keen and concerned about things like credit risk, which you'll see as we talk about the next topic. Any questions here? Okay, moving on to, I think, yep, here we go. We're going to talk about credit. So credit was talked about very briefly in the order that there should be collateral requirements. I think it broadly said 1 month of average payments. That right there gets a little tricky, because as you first sign up as an ESP, how do you know what that average really is going to be? But we certainly could come up with some formulas, and looking at the and the other thing that will have to happen is that the ESP will have to prove that they have collateral capacity up to a certain amount, regardless of how many customers they've signed up, because as they sign up customers, their collateral requirement will be increasing. So from that qualification perspective, that has to be thought through. Because you don't want a bunch of your customers getting signed up with the ESP, and then this ESP coming back and saying, I have these 10 customers, but I only have collateral for 5 of them. Now you end up having to go back to those 5 of those customers and say, sorry, your ESP can't serve you. And that will always look badly on PREPA. It'll never feel like the ESP was misstepping. So when it comes to the ESP, so as we thought about this and we dug a little bit deeper into the credit, there was sort of a recognition that that there was a bit of that there wasn't a lot of credit consideration taken on the level of credit that an ESP may have. So we remember that these are short-term credit issues. It's not like it's a long-term PPA where you have to worry about the long-term viability of the ESP. You're really worried about the ESP's viability over the next 60 to 90 days so that PREPA gets their payments that they're due. So, and in a lot of credit language, the counterparty's credit rating is a factor in establishing credit and establishing collateral requirements. And so we would like to recommend that same sort of consideration happen. This does not require PREPA to create a credit organization that is capable of assessing the creditworthiness of their PPAs, though I suspect they already have that in their wholesale space to be able to sign PPAs. But that said, I don't know for sure. So, but you can rely on external parties as a form of credit rating. There's the big 3, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. We would recommend that if an entity has a rating from one of these entities or many of these entities, that you go ahead and take that rating. If there's more than one, let's say they have a Moody's and an S&P, you would take the lower of the two, because typically it's just because one's lagging behind the other and you would rather be more conservative, that that potentially the credit is deteriorating versus improving. And then based off of the level of credit would be the amount of collateral that the ESP would have to post. Now let's talk about the amount of that collateral. So it was first in the order, it was contemplated that was 1 month's average. The problem is that when you run into a 60 to 90 day grace period for payments, you now can have the potential that the exposure is 2 to 3 months, not just 1. So that's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is that an average month may not be nearly equal to the maximum month. What we have found in the credit space, especially when it comes to ESPs the correlation between an ESP defaulting and market prices is quite high. And that's because ESPs, depending upon how they're structured, have exposure. So what you want to make sure is that you have sufficient collateral to cover those times when the ESP has relied heavily on the system, as we just talked about, for imbalances, has a large amount of energy that has been provided by PREPA on behalf of the ESP and flows through into those imbalance charges. And so that's why we recommend the 4 times. So the math is quite simply 3 months with a multiplier of about 30%. For accounting for the fact that the average month won't necessarily be the peak month. It's technically 33%, but and so that's the thought process around that. So there's 2 steps to this. The first is, what is the amount that is potentially due, and what's the credit amount that's at risk, and then the second is the credit rating, where you would require less. A smaller percent of the amount posted.
Margot, does this calculation assume that in this worst case scenario that the ESP provides no energy and PREPA is providing 100% of the energy for the 2 months? And that's where you're getting the numbers?
We're getting 3 because the potential maximum exposure is 3 months because of the 90-day payment.
Okay.
You're not going to have a credit risk problem if they're paying their bills within the 60 days. It's really that extreme event.
Okay, I didn't mean to emphasize this 60 versus 90. I was talking about, you're assuming that PREPA is providing 100% of the customer's energy needs and that the ESP is providing nothing for that period of time, and then enters default. So it's really a maximum ESP failure to supply power or pay PREPA.
Right, which is why you're applying the credit rating. Right? Because what you're really worried about is that maximum ESP failure on an ESP that has junk bond status. And you're just trying to protect PREPA's customers from picking that bill up.
And can I assume that when you're talking about these credit ratings, this could be the credit rating for the ESP or a parent company that's providing a line of credit, a letter of credit, or a bank that's providing a letter of credit, but that somebody with a good credit rating is standing behind the transaction.
That's right, and contract and party to the contracts. I'm going to leave it up to Mark to figure that part out, because now you're talking legalese, and I don't do that. I relied very heavily on my attorneys to make sure that our credit contracts were in really good shape. But yes, and that's why, that's why we believe this is an improvement, or I would call it more of a refinement, because you are going to give ESPs the benefit of the doubt if they have good credit. Moving on to the next item. Customer return process. Also, from what I could tell from the order, there was the issue of what happens if a customer returns to PREPA was not completely clear. Whether this is something that goes into the Universal Services Agreement or is separate. I put it into the Universal Services Agreement because it's an operational issue. But again, as I pointed out, operational issues should always be separated from your tariffs. But you need to have processes in place for these unfortunate events. So there's 3 ways that we've identified that a customer could return. First, the customer is unhappy with their supplier. They want to return to PREPA, so they ask to come back. The second one is the ESP decides, I don't want this customer anymore, so I'm going to return this customer to PREPA. And then the third is what we've sort of been talking about a little bit, which is that the ESP defaults and is no longer available to serve that customer. So we'll walk through each of these individually. So all of them, there's similar components: return charges, eligibility, service dates, return dates notification, and settlement. So firstly, just like there are exit charges related to a customer leaving that are included in the Esp fees in the Uniform Services Agreement, there should be return fees. Likewise, the administrative costs of converting a customer from an ESP back to PREPA, there's incremental costs that should be paid. If it's the customer's choice to do that, the customer should pay. The ESP should not be required to make that payment. It's sort of like insult to injury, if you will. You lost a customer, now pay me for losing them, type of thing. It also provides a little bit of an incentive for customers to think twice before they return. I doubt these fees, though, will be so significant that you would be worried about that. When it's the ESP choices, naturally the ESP pays that. If it's an ESP default, the fee gets still gets charged to the ESP and then gets baked into the settlement that happens as the ESP exits, if anything. And that's where we then start talking about where that collateral then comes into play. Eligibility. If a customer returns, what we don't want to do is see customers gaming and coming and going and coming and going because this month is cheaper for me to be with PREPA, and next month it's going to be cheaper for me to be with an ESP. This is for the benefit of the ESP as well. Again, gives the customer pause that they're making a long-term commitment to the ESP, which the ESP would prefer. If that's the case, and this is common, that if you return back to PREPA, you're not really eligible to move off to another ESP. This also allows it also limits competition to some degree, which you may think is good or bad, between ESPs. So an ESP that shops for customers to serve them only during certain times of year or whatever, it kind of eliminates that gaming aspect as well. If the ESP returns the customer, it's not the customer's choice. And so the customer should be eligible to move to an ESP again within a reasonable period of time. Again, we need to work through the administrative timing of these types of things. We're suggesting 30 days, which is about enough time from an administrative perspective to process that. This in part, but the customer who leaves or who's returned by an ESP cannot go back to that same ESP. They can go to a different one. But again, this is to prevent this gaming that a customer moves on and off of PREPA's system. And the ESP is clever enough to figure out, well, if I return you, you're not subject to the 12-month limitation. And you can come back to me in 6 months or 2 months or whatever. I will note that typically when an ESP is returning a customer, it's because that customer is probably not paying their bills, and so that's a consideration that you want to have, is that ESPs are unlikely to return customers, and contractually probably not able to return their customers unless that customer has perhaps violated a term and condition of the contract, for example, not paying their bills. Finally, if the ESP defaults the customer, again, no fault of the customer, they should be eligible to move to an ESP within 30 days. Service dates, again, as we talked about with when the customer signs off to become a customer, the conversions should also be paced and managed accordingly. You don't want somebody calling you up and saying, I'm returning this customer, they're yours as of tomorrow. You want to have there be some sort of a delay to manage that and make sure that all the billing goes through. The exception of that, of course, is with the ESP defaulting. When an ESP defaults, all the customers are suddenly PREPAs again. Return dates, return rates. What we want to make sure here is that if a customer has left the system and then when they return, they increase the cost to PREPA to serve, that those increased costs to serve are not borne by anybody else. The customer has made the choice to leave. They got their export credit accordingly. What you'll see is several, and again, this has to do with the rules around provider of last resort. If PREPA is required to always stand ready to take these customers, they will be having to make investments in anticipation of receiving them. Conversely, they can accept the fact that maybe these customers will come back, but if they do come back, they come back on a different rate that accommodates that higher level of cost of serving that customer, because PREPA has not necessarily prepared themselves for that. So how these return rates get flushed out is very important with respect to the market rules again. So how those market rules work, what the polar obligation truly is, how you track the cost of the polar obligation are all important components of these return rates. It's possible that the customer could return back to their standard rate, but you want to make sure that that is consistent with how you've been charging all of the credits and so on. So there's a lot of linkages here that you have to be concerned about. But like I said, it's not uncommon to see return rates where if a customer returns to the utility that they are on a special rate for a period of up to a year. Lastly, there's notification processes. We've just noted that we still want that customer protection, that the ESP doesn't just return PREPA and not tell the customer, that PREPA then confirms with the customer that they're returning, and so on. All about that customer care and making sure that, because at the end of the day, PREPA still has a relationship with these customers. And customers often rely upon their utilities to provide them with fair and accurate notifications and information. Lastly, on the ESP settlements, if it's customer choice or ESP choice, it follows the same settlement processes. If it's default, this is where collateral comes into play. And so you can kind of think of it in terms of a net payment. That you look at everything that is due and you look at the collateral held and you do a netting of those two things. And then there's a net bill. And again, that is all falls into the legal realm of things. Any questions on customer return? I mean, did I miss something? Had this been kind of thought through, or is this sort of an interesting perspective on how to think about this?
It's certainly an interesting perspective. I'm just wondering about the return rate. So for each class, the PREPA would have to have perhaps 12 return rates plus its standard rate active at any one time, because when a customer comes back, their rates would be fixed for the next 12 months based on forecast marginal costs.
Mm-hmm. There's the potential for that, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
The other thing is, you said that this kind of system is not uncommon, and I guess I'm not familiar with states that have open access that have this kind of provision. Do you have some jurisdictions in mind? Yes, it depends on the rate. So, for example, large
large customers in Pennsylvania, for example, tend to be on from a supply perspective from their utility can actually be on fairly detailed real-time rate type structures. So that makes it super easy. You don't really have to worry about the return rate. It's really more in the case where that's not the case, where that's not the situation, and that the commodity rate that customers are charged, or the energy rates that customers are charged, are reflective of a customer's portfolio. So I do know that PG&E has a provision for customers that return back. It's more related to their direct access than their CCAs, I believe, but I think it might actually apply to the CCAs as well. So that's another example. So again, it really depends on what that ultimate rate structure is, the tariff structure, on whether or not these return rates are necessary. And of course, linkage back again to the credit. How much of these credits, these generation credits, are tied to current conditions versus test year conditions or forecasted conditions, and that's really where you get this disconnect. Again, if it all links back, as I said, you don't really need a return rate if your generation credit is highly tied to what that cost is as well, because it's a push or pull. You're either paying it or you're not paying it. You're either a customer and you're paying it, or you're not a customer and you're not paying it.
Just to clarify, so for Pennsylvania, you said large customers on the large industrials on the utility service just pay a real-time rate.
It's a day. Yeah, it's a day ahead, I believe. Yeah.
As well. So were you saying that for other customers, Pennsylvania requires them to go on to a special rate for a period of time after they return?
Well, Pennsylvania, yeah. So actually no, but the reason why is because Pennsylvania utilities don't have a portfolio. So
you're saying that there is a special rate that's established for customers who come back?
Their rate structure is different, and that's why I was saying that the return rate has to be consistent with your rate structure. So what happens in Maryland and Pennsylvania and other states like that, the poles and wires business doesn't own supply. What they do is they contract out that supply, and the supply that's contracted out gets contracted out for class levels. So, a Baltimore Gas and Electric contracts with somebody to provide them with supply to meet residential load for 18 months. Those contracts are designed in such a way that the supplier takes the risk of what we call attrition, meaning customers coming back and forth. Mm-hmm. If PREPA is responsible for doing that, there's a risk to doing that, and that's why if the rate, again, you have to match up the return rate with the rate structure that's in place.
Okay. So Pennsylvania is not an example that you're referring to here, because the Pennsylvania utilities don't have an asset portfolio. So you said PG&E, the other states other than California that I'm aware of where the incumbent utility continues to own generation assets would be in Michigan and Oregon that have limited direct access options. So,
I can double check with PacifiCorp. I seem to recall at one point they might have, but then again, that's 20-year-old data, so I can go back and check their tariffs. But we certainly can provide some examples. Yeah. But let me go back and reiterate the reason, right? And if this is not a reason to be worried about, you don't need it. The reason is that you don't want a customer returning that increases the average cost for all PREPA customers. Their return should not change the average cost for generation supply. If it doesn't, you don't need a separate return rate. What you don't want to have happen is for a customer to have left and then they come back, particularly at times when the market's quite volatile, and they come back to the host utility, the provider of last resort, increasing the cost to serve for all other customers, because again, we're socializing it. If there's no risk of doing that, you don't need to have return rates. The reason we're highlighting it here is that it is unclear to us on whether or not there is that risk because the structure of how supply costs will be divided, how the market sector is going to be structured are still unresolved. So again, we're trying to create a framework that accounts for these issues, whether or not they specifically exist. And the reason why you see some utilities with these return charges is exactly for that reason, that maybe they've got their portfolio and they have wisely hedged their portfolio. Let's say a utility has extra energy because a customer has left, and they have wisely gone out and hedge that so that their customers don't receive the volatility of that market. Now all of a sudden that resource is quote unquote committed for, the customer comes back, there's no incremental cost. So there's a lot of things to unpack in how the sector is going to operate before you can determine whether or not customers returning are really going to create additional costs. I hope that helps, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay. Going on to the next slide. We have 5 minutes left, so I will jump past this. Actually, we've already talked a bit about true ups. I want to get to the key findings and challenges here. So operating model needs to be finalized. This is, we've done some what we've identified as some potential enhancements. To Mark's point, these will be part of an alternative proposal with justification as to why these refinements are needed versus what was put forward in the order. I don't think we've touched on all these, so we'll just move on to the challenges very quickly. And here we'll talk about, again, so next slide, please, Laura. I don't have this. Unfortunately, I do not have the slides memorized. Here we go. So again, the challenges, I've already talked about challenge number 2, terms and conditions require legal input. What we are proposing to file on May 10th is a term sheet that basically outlines the components that should be included in a uniform services agreement, what we think the mechanics of that are, and then they need to be converted into something that is legally robust. Challenge number 1 and 3 are both linked but have different implications. Again, sector restructuring is creating a lot of uncertainty, and roles and responsibilities continue to be in flux. As a result, it's unclear about what the Universal Services Agreement needs to cover with the ESP versus what other agreements between other entities might be. So, for example, if there's a generation company who's providing imbalances, is the generation company charging the grid co who charges the ESP for imbalances, or is the GenCo going to provide imbalances to the ESP directly? Those are all sector structure issues and contractual issues that need to be resolved. It's not to say that imbalance isn't an important part of the term sheet. It's to say which agreement does it go into. That still needs to be solidified. And then again, there's policy issues that remain unclear. I mentioned already environmental policy issues. Are the rules for suppliers going to be that they have to abide by that, or is that something that's going to be met by PREPA? If so, does PREPA charge the customer directly for those policy costs, or does PREPA charge the ESP and the ESP charges for those? Again, all issues that have to be resolved and understood before you can finalize these rates. So again, the resolution is to really emphasize the unbundling framework and the Uniform Services Agreement frameworks. We believe our proposal has all of the buckets identified, and everything that we're talking about now is how do you move things into which buckets, how do you determine what belongs in what bucket, what that value is that goes into that bucket, and all of those choices are going to be dependent upon how the final sector structure falls out. I think that concludes our slides. Sorry, I rushed through the last bit there, but you got 1 minute. I'm available after, so I can stay, but I want to be respectful of all of your time.
Thanks, Ms. Everett. Are any additional questions from the Energy Bureau at this point?
I don't know about the consultant, but I'm hungry. I don't have any questions. I'm just looking forward for the filing and see how the challenges are going to be resolved. And I don't know, Vanessa, if anyone else have any other questions.
Thanks, Commissioner. Or Paul or Mark, do you have any additional questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask the Independent Consumer Protection Office if there is any clarifying question on the information presented today.
Yes, please. One question that I have is the billing rate that you are designing. If for all customer classes, for example, for instance, if that apply for a single homeowner?
Most likely, there will be different credits to different customer classes. This is driven by two issues. The first is that the cost structure is sometimes different because costs are driven by both energy and capacity. So demand, kilowatts and kilowatt hours, and so cost to serve and credits to serve are linked to those. And so when you get into customer classes such as the residential class, they have a harder time understanding things like demand charges. So you end up baking all those costs into volumetric rates. While for very large customers, you might feel quite comfortable giving them demand and energy credits. So it's very likely that they will be different. The second reason is for billing data. You don't necessarily have the ability to bill residential customers on their demand, but you can bill them on their kilowatt hours. And so, sometimes you actually can't, right now you can't bill them on hourly kilowatt hours, but they have different load shapes, as you saw in that chart that we showed you with the coincident and load factor considerations. All those things weave into creating a credit that has to be class specific because it has to be tailored to class consumption and requirements on the system.
Yes, but the question is about the scope of work goal. It will be included then.
We will have a way of showing how those costs would be allocated, and then subsequently how you would calculate them. Again, any proposal that we put forward, we would say will be if indicative pricing, meaning that we will have to be making assumptions but the actual rates that should be implemented, in our opinion, cannot be determined until these structural issues are worked through. So what you will see is a way of calculating it and an indication of what these rates would be and how you would do it for the different customer classes, but the actual numbers should be considered indicative and draft, because until you get these other issues resolved, you just aren't going to know what those numbers should be.
Okay. I have another question. When you were talking about stability and congestion cost, you are taking into account the generation side and the load side for those costs?
So, right, that's ultimately what happens with congestion, is you're looking at where both the load is and where the congestion point is. Customers who are in common areas may have different congestion than others. It is not typical to see congestion charges by individual customer, meaning, oh, you're on the bad side of congestion, so you need to pay. It's typically socialized to the customer, but it does impact the cost of service if you start to and this is why we were talking back with the other consultants about the congestion charges are particularly tricky because of the idea that you're already socializing congestion today. You shouldn't necessarily charge ESPs more for congestion because they leave, unless that ESP is creating congestion.
Yeah, but it will be considered at both sides, generation and load, or only the load side?
So I think the answer, I'm hoping I'm understanding your question. So the congestion is driven by the relationship between where load is and where the ESP, the generation, is. As I said before, ultimately the customer pays for everything. It just depends on whose bill it shows up on, whether it shows up on the ESP's bill or it shows up on PREPA's bill. What we're suggesting is that congestion be monitored and started to be tracked with respect to the contribution that the ESP is making to congestion. The contribution of a customer to congestion is already accounted for.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I have one last question. When you were talking about self-generation, you were talking about a client that is doing self-generation on their premise, on their site, or virtual net metering? That they are in generation in one side and then they consume at the other side, at the other location.
Yeah, this is so let me first say that in the first instance, we are clearly saying that that on-site generation and the implications of on-site generation on things like transmission and distribution costs, if not handled well, create significant cost shift. And this is a debate that's going on in net energy metering all over the country. Where it will get a little tricky is a situation, and I don't know if this is a scenario or not, but again, where a large facility installs a large generation asset and effectively becomes an ESP, right? And that's what that basically becomes the scenario of virtual net metering, right? They become the ESP, they supply, and their customer happens to be other facilities that they have. So that's a potential scenario, and that would then fall under that but again, those customers are it's because this is considering supply that interconnects with the transmission system that then gets delivered to load. We're making that distinction. We're not contemplating here because it gets far more complicated about distribution connected supplies, meaning that the supply is directly connected or within the distribution bubble, for lack of a better word.
Okay, but then to clarifying, when you're talking self-generation, is that possibility that same company have one facility, generation facility on one side, and they're consuming that energy at the other place?
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's not, if that's, again, if that is a customer who is who's connected to the transmission grid, then I would say they would fall under the qualifications of an ESP, potentially. Again, these again are rules that have to be worked out. You're bringing up some really good questions. What we're talking about here is the customer that's a distribution level customer that is self-supplying is outside of scope. The self-supplying customer who's a transmission level customer, you could see it going either way. Let me put it that way.
Okay, thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, Engineer Cosme. So there not being any additional questions, I want to thank everyone for their participation today. And we are going to conclude today's technical conference at 1:09 in the afternoon. Again, thank you everyone and have a great lunch and a great day.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice night.